Ora entrano, bene o male.
Sorry, Chris. I didn't present.
No,
so
we will.
but anyway.
Yes, but anyway, yes. Okay. Pleasure to meet you. Pleasure to meet you. Dunque, buonasera a tutti.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Now we have a session full of important and fascinating lectures. This time we have to say that we have to finish by 6:30 because of the ceremony that we have immediately after. So this means that we will have a 30-minute discussion, no more than this, and this means that we have to be absolutely on time with our lectures. Okay, so now let me set 45 minutes. First of all, we have Enrico Faini, the consuls incunabula of the commune. I'm particularly interested. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, as is often the case when speaking of the communes, I too will begin by quoting Otto Friesing, the Italics so love freedom that they prefer to be governed by consuls rather than by imperantes. Otto's Gesta Friderici Primi Imperatoris dates from the mid-12th century. The exordium is therefore anachronistic in the context of this week. In my defense, I will say that occurrences of consuls interpreted as inconabula del comune in the 11th century are late and sporadic. Pisa and Lucca within the 1980s, Biandrata in 1093, Asti in 1095, Milan and Chiavenna in 1097, Arezzo and Genoa in 1098, according to a list that has become canonical. As Agenkeller noted already 30 years ago, none of these records is indicative of the establishment of the commune as we normally understand it. I take up Chris Wickham's definition of the ideal typical commune: self-conscious citizenships, gathering in assemblies, collective and temporary political offices, justice administered by technicians, systematic recourse to writing. This ideal type did not become established in northern Italy until around 1130. For the preceding age, between 1080 and 1130, taking up Alessio Fiore's suggestion, I would rather speak of a proto-communal phase, an era in which the modalities of urban self-government are barely discernible. The passage from the Gesta is employed today with much caution. The reason why I've chosen it is precisely the element that induces distrust, namely the fact that the Bishop of Freising is extraneous to the communal phenomenon. This foreigner is fortunate for us, since it is only Otto the foreigner, the monarchist, who describes the political regime, its pattern and motives. The need for clarity induces him to analogy, and in so doing generates the stereotype that Republican model, well known to those who, like him, were steeped in Orosian historiography. Looking at the stereotype from a different point of view, I will try to point out other and converging cultural patterns, not exclusive to the Italic world. To make this observation, it is necessary to move down from the level of historiographical concepts, the commune, the consulate, to the level of words, comune, consules, and check their possible intersections. I believe that changes in language are indicators of social changes. Italian communes, because of the richness and earliness of documentary attestation, have been an important chapter in the narrative of the European communal movement. They, through Daniel Wales' volumes on city republics in 1969 and John Kenneth Hyde's on society and politics in 1973, contributed to Quentin Skinner's reconstruction of the origins of modern political thought in the late 1970s. According to Skinner, it was the communal intellectuals who developed a republican ideology destined to change the character of power in the West. There is, however, another very concrete reason to start with the Italian communes. Only for them, in fact, does it make sense to ask whether the consuls were the incunabula of the commune in the rest of Europe. The early communal movement gathered under other terms. If we descend from the broader history of the communes to the specific topic of the Italic proto-communes, we know that cultural patterns have attracted attention, especially in the first phase of scholarly studies. The terminological identity between the ancient consulate and the commune could have led to the establishment of a parallel between the institutions. However, Muratori and Ponsavini already knew that the term had different functions in some early medieval cities. The title did not indicate political direction, but social prominence. For this reason, the spread of the term since the end of the 11th century was not considered as an indication of continuity with the ancient word, rather the expression of a new sensibility. In the 20th century, the consulship as an element of the political imagination has almost disappeared. From the questionnaire of historians, An Exception is a Fine Essay by Giancarlo Anderna, published in 2001, consuls remain an important demarcator for city autonomy, but they are inevitably brought back to Rome's republican past. In the last 50 years, scholars have preferred to deal with the concrete element, not the term consul, but consuls as people. As Giuseppe Sergi has written, at the basis of the flowering of studies on this theme lie, on the one hand, the monographic regional French-style approach, and on the other hand, the attention to prosopographical and relational aspects dear to German historiography. In this field, the presence between the 11th and 12th century of an Italic aristocracy with a markedly urban character has been reaffirmed by Renato Bordone and others. The enduring urban rootedness of Tuscan aristocracies until the 11th century has been documented by Maria Elena Cortese and Paolo Tomei. And all this, as suggested by the studies of Paolo Camarosano, François Menon, and Andrea De Grandi, does not mean that, especially from the 12th century onward, there existed only and always an urban aristocracy with organic relations with the territory. In a synthetic essay, 20 years ago, Paolo Grillo recognized two aristocracy, one rural and one urban. This means that the Italic cities did not cease to elaborate their own political cultures, from which, as we will see, would derive a peculiar language for social distinction capable of spreading outside the urban sphere. Over the course of the 20th century, there was a gradual shift to an empirical approach, attentive to singularities rather than commonalities. Perhaps partly because of it, the topic of cultural patterns has enjoyed less attention. In recent years, however, studies based on the culture of proto-communes have taken the field. I mention only a few names: De Angelis, Hartmann, von der Rhön, Cozza, Internullo. On the basis of their work, it is now possible to make comparisons on a European scale. Let us have the modern historians and return to the medievals. It will not have escaped notice in the quotation from Otto Friesing the distinction he proposes, consules versus imperantes. The consecutive phrase seems to approach the libertas of a citizen magistrate to the arbitrariness of an imperator. However, a few pages earlier, it is the sovereign himself, pulchre communi utilitati consulens, who orders a tax levy to compensate the bishops of Trent and Brixen. This is not an isolated case. At the beginning of the Gesta, Otto had evoked the predatory attitude of Archbishop Adalbert of Mainz at the time of the election of Lothar III. This calling into question communis utilitas, commune commodum and consulere sounds familiar to the scholar of the commune. Ducange's glossarium and Niemeyer lexicon minus allow us to find numerous meanings of consul. We thus discovered that the term itself does not at all separate the word of the commons from the monarchical ideology promoted by Otto. We know that Quintilianus and Florus derived the term from the verb consulere, and this was the etymology reported in Papias Ars Grammatica, making that term a synonym for imperator was moreover an ancient practice, which we can trace back to at least to Charlemagne. The term had even derived a broader meaning in the Europe of local powers. It had become a synonym of count. It is also in the Bella Parisiaque Urbis of Abbo of Saint-Germain as early as the late 9th century, then in Dudo of Saint Quentin and William of Poitiers in the 11th, but also in the 12th century continuation of the Actus of the Bishops of the Le Mans, in the Gesta of the Counts of Anjou, or in the Chronicle of Galbert of Bruges. An anonymous Englishman around 1130 in the so-called Leges Eduardi Confessoris even offers us a small essay on the history of institutions. He quotes in Latin,
Temporibus Romanorum in regno isto Britanniae vocabatur consulatus. La paretimologia.
The paretimology, as Mark Bloch pointed out, may be the result of consonants between the Latin consul and the Old French word for count, Kunz. On those who study the Italic communes, however, the word's vitality on the Atlantic coast exerted no attraction. For that matter, there is one element that makes the northern consul different from its Mediterranean counterpart, the plural. The Italic consules numbered many and acted together. These two, however, is true from a certain point in time, as Veronica Westhaling has recently reiterated. The word consul in the early Middle Ages in cities of longer Byzantine tradition, such as Rome and Ravenna, did not denote an office, but had a socially distinctive value. We must, to be sure, distinguish between early medieval consules and communal consules, but to what extent was this possible in the 11th century? Before the consulship became a regular magistracy, that's before about 1120, I doubt that the Italics distinguish aristocratic, let us say, Byzantine-style consules from incunabular communal consules. Precisely in the ambiguity of the word lies, in my opinion, one of the keys to understanding its political fortune. Consul might appear to be a reminder of ancient Rome, as the learned clerics liked it, but for all, it was also a marker of social excellence. We can follow the word consul to Rome at the turn of the 11th and 12th centuries, where the ambiguity was described in Dario Internullo's recent book. In 1111, Henry V sent a letter to Consules Senatus Populus Maiores et Minores of Rome. The consules reappear between 1128 and 30 in the communication between the Romans and Lothair III, and it is hard to believe that they were only aristocrats and not already true political representatives. The first hint that the consules in Rome were or could be something other than mere mayors come from a judicial document from 1088. In it, alongside the Juban prefect, the consules communitatis bonum are mentioned. Agreed. These are all aristocrats who could have titled themselves consules even without bothering with the enigmatic communitas bonum. However, precisely, why associate one's title with a communitas in the same years in which the term consule spread throughout Regnum Italiae? Let us go back to the heart of the 12th century. The consules mentioned between 1141 and 43 are not aristocrats. They exercise a judicial function framed in Internullo rights in a transitional regime marked by the collaboration between papal power and citizenship. These consules could really represent incunabula of the commune, but this is a false departure. When in 1143 the populace of Rome established an authentically communal regime, that regime took the name of Senate, not commune, and its representatives were senators, not consuls. In the late 1140s, the term consul reappears in Roman sources, but it has returned to designate only a social preeminence, and is still so in the first decades of the 13th century. The Roman case teaches us two things. The first is that consul, even after acquiring its communal meaning, so to speak, could return to denote the aristocratic, a sign that the word had never really lost its high medieval meaning. The second is that the names given to regimes and magistracies in the 11th and 12th centuries were a choice that was the result of a political direction. This is demonstrated by the case of a commune that, in order to imitate the ancients, oust the aristocracy linked to the Pope and reaffirm a higher rank than its northern cousins, chose to call itself senatus and set aside the term consul. Among the first isolated attestations of communal consules, there is a singular chronological coincidence. It will have been noted that the earliest Italic attestations come from the same area and the same decade. The area is that between Pisa and Lucca. The years are the 80s of the 11th century. The same as the Consules Communitatis Bonum of Rome, the same, it will have to be said, as the explosion of the civil wars in connection with the so-called struggle for the investitures. Let us dwell on the manner through which we have this information. Much and reasonable distrust surrounds the very first mention of the Pisan consuls. On the basis of a study by Mauro Ronzani, it is now believed that the word consul designated in the Pisa of the 8080s simple aristocrats, as it did in the Rome of the height of the Middle Ages. Only later would the new meaning of chief citizen spread, which emerges more clearly in the 1990s, thus from the Roman sphere, through a kind of osmosis motivated by the search for Pisan Romanitas. To use the expression coined by Giuseppe Scalia, the term would have passed into the Tyrrhenian city and from there into the cities of the north. There are two aspects of this interpretation. The first concerns the problematic evaluation of the term consules, whose earliest Pisan and Lucchese attestations come from slightly later literary texts, or from documents written outside the local context. The Carmen in Victoria Pisanorum, which names Pisan consuls as the head of the city's fleet in 1087, was placed by Alberto Cozza in the late 1080s. The earliest citation comes from a Sardinian language text. The consuls of Lucca already seem to be true representatives of the citizenry in the Vita Metrica Anselmi, a poetical text drafted by the local bishop Rangerio in the last years of a century. The second aspect I collect is perhaps the most important, the idea that is that models of aristocratic representation could be consciously imitated and could spread in a very short time, a decade or so, from Rome to Milan. However, if in Rome but also in Ravenna the old distinctive meaning of consul was a lexical resource available since the early Middle Ages, why did people wait until the era of the civil wars to adopt it widely? Probably because there was something to describe in Italic cities from the 1980s onward that was not there before. I'm not entirely sure, however, that the only new thing was self-government. Let me go back to Northern Europe. Anyone looking for the term comunio, comune, or comunitas to define a different political regime than the traditional one need not look to Italy. We know that the term spread across the peninsula, except for a few isolated cases, only after 1120, roughly the same years in which the ideal typical commune was established. I believe that this is not accident. In fact, I'm convinced that is in Rome with the Senate. In many other cities, the term also indicated a regime supported by new groups of non-privileged bearers of an original ideological core. However, I will not dwell on these facts, which are too much later than the century we set out to investigate. Instead, I will follow the spread during the 11th century of a group of lemmas connected with the noun comune, employed to designate a political initiative. Pierre-Michel Quentin, in his valuable semantic study on universitas, clarified how the lexical oscillation comune, communitas, communia, communio is to be associated with the uncertain latent translation of a vernacular term. What does this term indicate? It seems excessive to me to speak of a true political institution that provides for durability. Rather, I would speak of political initiatives. They could include some degree of self-management, but not an irreversible break with traditional power. Dominique Barthélemy traced the early fortunes of communio, which took place in the context of oaths of peace of truce. The first attestation of the noun communio to define a political initiative dates back to 1064 in the Episcopate of Barcelona. Here, in a covenant to establish a truce, it was stipulated that the bishop could facere comunionem to repress transgressors. No consul is named here. Let us move then to France proper, to Le Mans and the revolt that occurred there in 1070. Here, the citizens, irritated at the rapacity of the count's representative, decide to organize themselves into a communio. Telling us about this is a later source, the 12th century continuation of the Actus of the Bishops of Le Mans. The somewhat later chronology makes us suspicious about the reliability of the account, but not to the point that we do not derive some useful elements from it. The significant element, I recall, is the possible intersection between the communio and the word consul. In this sense, the narrative compactness of the testimony is the most interesting fact. In the text, we find both communio and consul, as we also find them placed in a close chronology, but they are ascribed to opposite semantic domains. Communio is the one we have seen above. Consules, on the other hand, are the counts of Maine. So, if the communio is a new power, the consules represent the traditional power against which political initiative is organized.
Let us move to Cambrai in 1077. The life of Bishop Gerard II, from which I derived the news, was probably written shortly after 1092. So we can rely on the recent reinterpretation offered by Nicolas Ruffini Ronzani. The life of Gerard records a communia sworn by the citizens of Cambrai against the local bishop and count. The communia was short-lived, but there are similarities with the case of Le Mans. In the gist, however, consuls are never mentioned. I do not want to go beyond the 11th century, and I will therefore dwell on an urban revolt that Etienne Dublez already mentioned, the one organized in 1073 by the citizens of Worms against the local bishop and in favor of the ruler, the young Henry IV. Historiography has also linked this event to the communal movement. However, the annals of Lambert of Hersfeld, our source, do not mention a noun that can be associated with commune. We are dealing with a political initiative of the citizenry, not the establishment of a communal regime. It will come as no surprise to learn that consuls are not remembered in Worms either. Why then can this episode be instructive? Because Henry, grateful for the support, grants a privilege to the citizenship in January 1074. This is therefore one of the rare cases in which we can verify what the documentary outcomes of political initiatives were. In Henry's diploma, there is no mention of either consuls or commune. The privilege is issued simply to the habitatores civitatis. I cannot analyze all other cases of city political initiatives within the 11th century. We can say that some of them are referred to by terms connected with the noun commune. These are sworn peace of revolts against traditional powers, mainly counts and bishops. We cannot say, however, that they are anti-monarchical initiatives, as the case of Worms shows well. Outside Italy, moreover, none of these initiatives is connected with the term consules. Indeed, consules, understood as counts, are sometimes the target of the revolt. Then, how are the chiefs called? Well, these chiefs have no name and no definition. Outside the Italian kingdom, communal consules begin to appear in the Midi only around 1130, Avignon in 1129, Arles, Béziers, and Narbonne 1131. And until around 1120, in the Italic sphere, political initiatives are linked to consules, but not to the noun commune. The only time we find mention of a communum in northern Italy in the 11th century, that is Cremona 1097, the consuls are not there. The only case where a connection can be observed is thus the Communitas Bonum of Rome, apparently governed by consules in 1088. It is not clear, however, whether this is a meeting of consulate and proto-commune. If we are to lend faith to Rangerio, the consuls of Lucca in 1081 rebelled against the rule of Matilde of Canossa in agreement with the schismatic bishop Peter and the sovereign. Moreover, they were engaged in peace initiatives, Su Pacis Specie Bella Dolosa Movement. The Pisan consuls were at the head of a military expedition in 1087, but already around 1091 they were attending a compromise between some city owners and the rural population, the Lodo di Val di Sirchio. In a Pisan case too, we are probably faced with a pacification based on a collective oath, very similar to the one recorded in the Tregua de Lombardica of the first half of the 11th century. This will be shown by the reference to the city populace, the destruction of houses and property threatened to violators, and the excommunication imposed on them by the bishop. Little can we say for Arezzo and Genoa, where a consul seems to appear only incidentally in the documentation. In Asti, several consuls are mentioned in action as early as 1095, but the tradition of the document is late, and as we can suggest, we cannot rule out interpolations. In rural Lombardy, consuls appear generically as representatives of the communities on the occasion of grants of franchises, biandrade, and transactions concerning common property, chiavenna. The relationship of these documents to the urban lexicon should be investigated in order to understand any trajectories of diffusion. However, it is significant that such diffusion is conceivable in the Lombard area, where the relationship of the urban aristocracy with the territory was more organic. We can add to these cases the Milanese Consulatus of 1097, cited according to Fissore and Lucioni, as part of a pacificatory action promoted by the consuls. However, we are in a framework more oriented towards the technical resolution of the disputes, given also the dense presence of judices. We can say that some initiatives of the consuls in Italian cities at the end of the 11th century, Pisa, Lucca, Milan, resemble those in the rest of Europe, not for rebellion but for the search for peace, which of course presupposes conflict. Such initiatives are linked to the term consules in Italic context, elsewhere to the words comune communio. I do not believe that the difference in terminology is indicative of constitutional differences, if you will pardon the term. We must, however, recognize a distance between the world of comune and that of consules. This distance does not lie in the quality of the political initiatives. Rather, it lies in the imagery of those who describe them, and perhaps in the social background of the protagonists. The semantic scope of the comune is connected with oaths of peace and truce. The consuls of Milan, Pisa, and Lucca also favored peacemaking, although in Italic kingdom there was an early start on the path of writing and technicality. The name of the consules seems to refer to a different model of representation than that of the comune. Which one? We are about to see. Now, however, I'd like to point out that the welding together of the imagery of the comune and that of the consules did not occur in Italy and the rest of Europe until after 1120. What then are consuls? What descriptive needs are met by this word? To understand this, the northern counts consuls serve only in part. Nicolas Paul has recently focused on them. In a chronicle of the deeds of the consuls of Anjou, perhaps the word consul was perceived as a reference to the men of action of antiquity and could serve to actualize the ennobling of homines nobi. More instructive for the Italic case, however, seems to me the cultural operation carried out in Saxony. Around 1075, a cleric trained in the cathedral school of Würzburg or Bamberg completed a history devoted to the archbishops of Hamburg-Bremen. The learned writer known as Adam of Bremen had been called upon around 1066 by the prelate Adalbert, a figure who is a giant in the third book of the history. The work is offered to Adalbert's successor, Limar, not only to inform him about the rights of the Hamburg See, but also to warn him about the risk of princely management of power. This Germanic cleric consciously actualized the ancient term consul, adapting it to a contemporary circumstance. In 1063, in fact, Adalbert had been associated with the Archbishop of Cologne, Anno, in the regency of the still too young King of Germany, Henry. He had become an advisor to the king. It is true that already in the Carolingian age we have some attestation of an employment of the term consul in a similar sense, and it is true that the meaning is even found in Papias, but in my opinion, there are some contextual elements to ponder. The passage is particularly pregnant. Let us listen to it. Tandem seditionibus ad pacem inclinatis ad Albertus et anno archiepiscopi consules declarati sunt, et in eorum concilio deinceps summarerum pendebat. The term consul is used here to describe a non-ordinary, very high-level, elective and collegial political role. This will be enough to bring these usages closer to the Italian political initiatives of the following decade. But to understand what imagery this terminology comes from, I think another word we read in this passage is important. Seditiones. What prototype consul might the writers of the 11th century have had in mind? The afterthoughts of scholars of the Comune, as in the past been the Republican Libertas. This pre-comprehension came into crisis when awareness became widespread of the distinctive value that the term consul had in the early Middle Ages. According to the new acquisition of historiography, the early Italian consuls would no longer be the incunabula of a republican regime, rather local aristocrats. Deconstruction has done its own work and downsized the cumbersome commonplace of proto-communal republicanism. I do not think, however, that we can be satisfied with the resulting vacuum. The consuls of the proto-commune were not the standard bearers of the republic, all right, but neither were they the continuation of the traditional regime. They were, after all, consules civitatis or compagni, so they did not speak for themselves alone, but as representatives of a larger whole. In contrast, no consul ever participated under this title in the moments in which the traditional powers performed in a placita. If there's one thing we can say with reasonable certainty, it is that the institutors of the Republic of Ancient Rome, Collatinus and Brutus, were not Adam's model. Certainly, the office given to Anno and Adalbert was not an alternative to monarchy. However, there was something unprecedented that Adam could not explain except by using a term, consul, learned in school books. What books, precisely? The model on which the Bremen cleric relied to describe a heroism of minority was not the founding of the Roman Republic, learned from reading Orosius, but its crisis, learned from reading Sallust. Spy of these might be the reference to seditiones, so close to the term consules. For Adam, Sallust was a model not only because of the tragic portrayal of Adalbert, but also because of the context of the civil war and moral crisis within which his relationship with the royal court is set. Allow me not to review the many occurrences of the Bellum Jugurthinum or the Coniurazione Catilina in Adam's history. According to Giorgio Brugnoli and Fabio Stock, who have devoted valuable studies to Sallust's influence on Adam, the systematic nature of the quotations is unprecedented in medieval literature. On a more general level, Beryl Smalley has highlighted Sallust's impact on chronicles of the period at the turn of the 1100s. Smalley writes, marked by cynical pessimism, Sallust offered a moral interpretation of the political crisis. Nothing better, I say, to justify the multiple conflicts that emerged in the last decades of the 11th century. In the new assessment of Sallustian impact on historiography, I also follow what Elisa Brilli and Carla Meyer suggest for later urban contexts. Early Italic literary works that mention the consules are fully immersed in seditiones, or make open reference to a season of civil wars. The expression bellum civile is in the sources. Thus, the anonymous author of the peasant poem tries to reconstruct a compact political attitude at a time of dramatic changes in the urban ruling group. Rangerio presents us with a Lucca torn apart by an episcopal schism. The literary suggestion is not fitting for the document on the Roman consuls, but I note how it is set in a Rome in which opposing factions were contending for the papacy. Urban II would have been elected perilously just in 1088. Sallust will be well present in the intellectual context of the Roman proto-commune, and is also the model recalled by the highly cultural chronicle Arnulf around 1075 to describe a Milan torn apart by the struggle between Patarini and traditionalists. Clear references to the Sallustian model can be found in the earliest Ars Dictaminis treatises, from the Flores Rhetorici to Adalbert Samaritan's Precepta Dictaminum. So the Precepta, composed in Bologna around 1115, we find explicit quotations from Sallust and references to the proto-communal consules. Of course, Sallust is not the only ancient author to be called upon, but reading his works could offer the Bolognese magister a vision of the consul, and above all of the res publica that was warmer, more dynamic, and less technical than the one we find in Ciceronian De Inventione. Arnulf of Milan and Adalbert Samaritan are thus good witnesses to an intellectual temperament in which certain ancient authors could become models not only for Latin but also for the political circumstances and even a state of mind they called into question. The time has come to give an answer to the question in the title. The answer I feel like giving is that the consuls are the incunabula of the commune only indirectly. On a European scale, the political initiative of citizenships are most often recognized by the terms comune, communitas, communio, communia, or even pax and tregua. Consul in the West is often a way of referring to comes. European cities certainly had no shortage of seditiones, and Sevilla Bella, but a new lexicon connected with the noun communion was used to describe overcoming critical moments. There must have been an all-Italic peculiarity that made the old term consul more seductive than communio. Perhaps this peculiarity lay in the wealth of meanings the term had taken on in this context. I believe that what favored the option for consul was the social profile of the groups involved in political initiatives. In the cities of the Italic kingdom, a less differentiated profile than the previous holders of power and continuity in the urban residence of the aristocracy may have prompted the exploitation of ambiguity. Consul was simultaneously an expression of social distinction and a reference to the political leaders of ancient Rome. Not surprisingly, after 1120, when the social profile of these groups changed, the noun comune of Transalpine origin was massively adopted to describe the regime they established. This was probably the case in Genoa and Pisa, so it certainly happened in Rome in 1143, although they opted for Senate instead of Comune. The change in the designation of leaders and political initiatives shows a cultural osmosis which I believe was the result of actual social turnover. The ambiguity of the term consul favored its simultaneous diffusion in literary and documentary circles. Thomas Cole has shown that around 1100, narrating the conflict by placing it in a known framework, attempting to make it exemplary, was a useful strategy for a lasting and beneficial resolution of the conflict itself. I believe that the Sallustian paradigm of the moral crisis of the res publica represented a unifying frame in the age of schisms, the expression of his calls, a meta representation in which to relocate and with which to explain multiple and distinct local conflicts. The word consul could constitute, in this sense, a kind of synecdoche for the literati, a reference to a context through one of its components. This was especially true for Italic cities, since ultimately Rome's history of civil war is a history of urban conflicts. By the late 11th century, in short, there was a shared model for representing and explaining what was happening in so many cities. At the same time, the epithet consul could even be sought by the subjects described because it was perceived as traditional and ennobling. In general, I believe that the ambiguity of terms allows for innovation even in an ideologically conservative context. The formal respect for the inherited meaning facilitates the dissemination of new meaning. Of course, it is difficult to understand through what channels the word of the literati, often churchmen, could interfere with everyday political practices. We should not forget, however, that in the environment of italic cities, Ronald Witt placed the fusion of the two Latin cultures, the bookish and documentary, which remained separate throughout the early Middle Ages. A key role in this fusion work could have been played by the Judices. The part played by these Judices in the political direction of urban communities between the 11th and 12th century is a subject of increasing scholarly interest. Perhaps it is really no coincidence that the cultural, elevated and Romanizing of the Judices of Pisa, the first city in which we find consuls incunabula of the Comune, has recently caught the attention of Alberto Cozza and Maria Cristina Rossi. So, in conclusion, more than of the Comune, the consul seems to me the incunabula of a certain way of representing power, a non-idealized representation, but surprisingly realistic one, aware of both social distinctions and the conflict within which political initiatives were located. Something from which the Comune could be born, certainly, but which around 1100 was perhaps not so much recognized in the triumphs of the Roman Respublica as in the dramatic history of its crisis. Thank you. We cannot hear. Microphone, please. Thank you for this fascinating lecture, Enrico. And thank you also because you spoke only for 40 minutes, and this can help us a lot, even because at the end we will have the opportunity to have a longer discussion. We will see. Anyway, let's move on. And Professor Verbal.
Over to you.
Thank you.
And I'll put the 45 minutes on.
Yeah, I'll try to keep inside. Anche se parlerò in inglese, vorrei innanzitutto...
I will speak English, but I would like to thank the organizations and the organizers for inviting me, and especially Alessandra Massari for the care she had eliminating all the problems that occurred. It is my pleasure to speak here in Spoleto, to find some old friends and make some new friendships. It is an honor to be part of this honorable tradition and long tradition and follow the steps of those incredible names before us. I'm thinking of Maradona Fanga, who was a guest here. He has been a guest for several times. And even though he had a completely different approach from mine, so I will change now my language. I will continue with with English.
Misplaced perhaps in this section on the structures of power, the dimensions and changes. But being convinced that modern conceptions of literature as an art form have precluded all too often our understanding of writing and reading in pre-modern times, I want to embed both more inherently into their historical reality. Yet, being as well convinced, on the other hand, that written texts of pre-modernity are taken too easily as historical sources, to reconstruct historical factuality, this means, I need to counter this historicizing by stressing the literary techniques as they form part and parcel of pre-modern writing and reading. In the book on the Loire poetics that I finished during the period of COVID, and that waits for the final touch whenever academics allows me the spare time to do so, I therefore started by analyzing the poetics of the group of poets that are in scholarship commonly referred to as the Loire poets. About a century ago, this group of poets was recognized as forming something of a Dichterkreis. Later still, a school, an école. Both labels have been heavily criticized because we can hardly speak of a closed circle or the establishment of a true school. But nobody can deny that something happened during the second half of the 11th century in the approach of writing. And even though I fully agree with Professor Wickham yesterday and some of the colleagues with whom I spoke that the revolutionary turning points are rare and mostly fit into long-term evolutions, I dare to label as a true revolution what happens in the approach to reading and writing in the last decades of the 11th century. And it would have lasting effects on the written culture in the Latin West. This renewal in poetics, and I label poetics as a specialized technique of writing, appears in a region that stretches from the west of the empire over Reims as the in-between towards the Atlantic coast in future France, following somehow the flow of the Loire and then jumps over to Norman England. The names most frequently, and I'll have a look, that's later, we'll come to that later. The names most frequently associated with this literary current are Geoffrey of Reims, Marbot of Rennes, Baudry of Bourgogne, and Hildebert of Lavardin, Le Mans, or Tours. This last one will function as the case study today. There are others, Raoul Tourtier and Fulcoyers of Beauvais, Reginald of Canterbury perhaps. And then the mass of anonymous poets whose works can be found in the many anthologies that come onto being during this period. In the final chapter of my book, I place these poets into their historical context and show how this new poetics not only must be understood from the perspective of the historical context, but even deepens our understanding of it. It is from this chapter that I draw for today's contribution. What I propose to do now is to introduce you to one poet who was considered to be the most esteemed writer in the region that would become France, but that was still far from being so. He held some of the most influential positions in his time and in the region. First, I give you the historical facts, that is what we know about him, mostly apart from his own work. Then I focus on the image that historiography has retained of him as an illustration of the misconceptions I mentioned. We take a brief look at the period and the developments that are most important for understanding him. Finally, I'll try to show you how to read his work in the context of the times and his life. So let's start with the character Hildebert. I decided for the personality of Hildebert, of Lavardin, because there was he born, or of Le Mans, where he became bishop, or of Tours, where he ended his career and his life as archbishop. His fame as an ecclesiastical dignitary did not outweigh his fame as a writer, as we'll see. Already during his lifetime, he was recognized as the greatest poet of his time, and his reputation would endure for several decades. What's more, his letters were used as models in schools where they were copied and memorized even a century later. I give you the most important dates known from the life of Hildebert. Of course, I excluded all the charts and documents concerning the local situations and politics. The succession by Hildebert of Hoel, Bishop of Le Mans, in 1096, was probably foreseen and even prepared for. Hildebert had already signed documents as archdeacon and scholasticus, two functions which almost designated him as the successor, although this was not accepted by everyone. As a result of the struggles for authority over the city of Le Mans, and I'll return to this later on, between William II the Red, William Rufus, King of England, Count Helios of Maine, I will just go, and I will return to this later. Count Helios of Maine and Count of Anjou, Fulk I, Hildebert was obliged to follow in 1099 the king into exile in England, where he had to stay for a few months before returning to Le Mans around Easter 1100. At the end of 1100, Hildebert undertook a journey to Rome, from which he did not return until the middle of the following year. After the death of Count Helios in 1110, Hostilities between the rivals of authority in Maine resumed, and Hildebert was taken hostage for a few weeks by one of the lesser lords. In 1116, Hildebert gave permission to a wandering preacher, Henry of Lausanne, to preach during Lent and his absence for the Lateran Council. Henry's sermons led to a revolt by the people against the ecclesiastics, which did not end with the hasty return of the bishop and the expulsion of the preacher. On April 25, 1120, Hildebert consecrated the Cathedral of Le Mans, dedicated to Saint Julien. He had resumed the reconstruction works that were begun by his predecessor. In 1125, while Hildebert was looking after the affairs of the Archbishopric of Tours after the death of the Archbishop, he was elected a successor and immediately recognized by Pope Honorius II and King Louis VI the Fat, which is very remarkable because such an immediate recognition was rather rare in that period. He died as Archbishop of Tours in 1133. Okay, that's the dates of the person, for those who did not know anything about him. His works then. Although Hildebert held the highest dignities in two cities of major significance for both the state of the church and politics, Hildebert would never have received as much attention without his written works. Hildebert's letters belong to his most popular and influential writings. Around 100 letters have been preserved, including an initial collection of 56 letters composed by Hildebert himself. The collection, was composed by Hildebert himself on a non-chronological basis, and we'll return to that later on, and with a strong emphasis on the years 1100 to 1108. This first collection was later extended by another 50 or so letters, which were more in chronological order. From this collection, we know 116 manuscripts, of which only 17 or so do not belong to the 12th or the 13th centuries. It is no coincidence, therefore, that no reliable critical edition exists, as is very often the case with sources that are very important because they were very popular. As a priest, of course, Hildebert also preached. 9 sermons have survived, scattered in around 20 manuscripts. These sermons were clearly not considered to be of great importance, neither by Hildebert, who apparently did not pay as much attention to them as he did to the letters and poems, nor by his contemporaries. Most of Hildebert's poetic work consists of short poems, rarely exceeding 50 lines. He circulated them in small booklets, libelli, which contained up to 10 poems. Most of these poems ended up in anthologies which underwent a renaissance and revival at the end of the 11th century, a remarkable revival, we must say. The number of anthologies increased remarkably, and they increasingly included contemporary authors, which was even rare before. These Carmina Minora, as they are called by the editor, by Hildebert, are scattered all over the place, both in groups and singly. The edition of them, by Scott, has shown that Hildebert himself made at least 2 collections of his own poetry, and probably a third as well. In 2 of these collections, we can clearly see the hand of a composer who knows what he wants to express. We'll come back to this later. Besides the Carmina Minora, there's a collection of short poems that deal with biblical subjects. Perhaps they were written with didactic purposes in mind. They were much less popular than the others. You have the poem De Mysterio Missae, on the mystery of the Mass. It is a small work containing around 35 short poems that deal with the various moments during the Mass. It enjoyed immense popularity, and for this reason, of course, has not yet been critically edited. Equally important was his epic hagiography, the life of Saint Mary the Egyptian, a poem of 900 lines, disyllabic leonine hexameters, sometimes also double rhyme and combined with final rhyme, called by Meyer in the beginning of the 20th century tripartiti caudati. It is a true masterpiece of virtuosity and was immediately recognized as such. It is undoubtedly this poem that earned Hildebert the name of extraordinary poet. The choice of the saint is remarkable. Mary the Egyptian is a nymphomaniac who converts and lives 40 years in the desert, where she is found by a monk to whom she tells her life story. Also this will be important later on. Finally, Hildebert also wrote a Posimeter, Liber de Queremonia et Conflictu Carnis et Anime, the book of complaint and conflict between flesh and soul. Like his model Boëthius, of course, Hildebert depicts his confrontation with an allegorical figure who accuses him of infidelity and inconstancy. This woman is apparently his soul. It's never made very clear, actually. The question remains open as to whether the work is finished, but Hildebert, in any way, incorporated it into his own collections. And then he wrote two lives of saints in prose, a life of Hugo of Cluny, who died in 1109, and this was a contemporary. Writing a hagiography of a contemporary is also one of those strange things that happen in these periods. And the life of Radegund of Poitiers. His poetic works are difficult to date, not least because Hildebert often reworked them, not only to improve them poetically, but also, as we shall see, to adapt them to change the situations. Sometimes we know the date of the recipient's death. The life of Mary must have been finished before 1107, because it is mentioned by a poet in England in his own work, Reginald of Canterbury. And that work is dated. The Queremonia must be dated after one of the battles in which Le Mans fell victim, probably in 1099, 1100. At the beginning of the work, Hildebert depicts himself as being busy rebuilding his bishop's palace. Okay, let's continue to the image of Hildebert. What historians have done with it, with all this? Three studies are at the root of all the references to Hildebert. You see them here, Horiot, Dieudonné, and of course Peter von Moos. Now, given that Horiot is mainly concerned with separating Hildebert's authentic little poems from those falsely attributed to him, and that von Moos uses the data as presented by Dieudonné, I will limit myself here to giving you the portrait as von Moos presents it. His work has become a classic, not only for studies of Hildebert, but also for the whole discussion of the 12th century Renaissance. Let me quote the portrait as he describes it in the conclusion of his study, which runs to over more than 400 pages. This highly respected bishop, who went to great lengths to fulfill the duties of his office, was also a much appreciated poet and letter writer, who did not consider his work to be of lesser value than that of the Sacri Poetae of antiquity, and claimed their dignity. He was also a teacher of morals, as his status as a grammaticus demanded. And he always insisted on balance, gentleness, common sense, and conformity with nature, following the examples of the ancient masters of wisdom. He rejoiced in a cultivated life, and in a circle of like-minded clerics, princes, and ladies, he defended by word and example the ideal of urbanitas, serene morality, and spiritual nobility, in the sense of the harmonious development of men's own powers. Throughout his work, we sense tenderness, indulgence, fear of extremes, joy for all that is beautiful in the visible and invisible world, openness to common humanity, to the achievements of man's own strength, and thus to the greatness of the old world. Nostalgia for retreat, for silent study, or for contemplative exchange with that which is superior. All these efforts to come closer to the Lord, I jumped some parts, of course, this total commitment that seems material to us, constituted the background against which Hildebert carried out, in a still hidden and almost anachronistic way, a re-evaluation of the measure of man, which was to impose itself after him in courtly culture. He could have opposed the considerable efforts of his time, sapientis est meteri vires, nec aliquid ultra profiteri. He would have felt included in the society to come, which sought to achieve what he had in mind in philosophy, art, the theory of the state, and decorum. The perfect man in body and soul, as nature intended. Now, I just want to ask you, isn't that a lovely portrait? It shows as a man you want to know, you want to meet. For me, as a literary scholar, and it should be for every historian, I think, that's enough reason to be cautious. Let's go back to the history of these regions around 1100. The main region lies at a strategic crossroads for the most important political forces of the time and the larger region. Normandy, and therefore England, the Duchy of Brittany, the County of Anjou, the County of Blois, and the Kingdom of France. And we have yesterday seen how much important is the territorialization, the territoriality of all those smaller powers, especially in these periods. The modern maps, of course, is a modern reconstruction, and of course this modern map gives only a very stylized view of the real situation. The city of Tours, for example, fell under the jurisdiction of the king, and the archbishop could only be appointed with his consent. Royalty was only beginning to assert itself in the last decades of the 11th century, thanks to the actions of Philip II, and later, especially, with even greater vigor, by his son, Louis VI the Fat. Le Mans, in particular, was the target of expeditions and military confrontations between the powers. During the few decades around 1100, the city constantly changed hands between the Count of Anjou, Fouques, the Duke of Normandy, the King of England, and the Count of Maine, Helias, who did not want to be robbed of his own capital. In addition, Le Mans was one of the first towns, as we heard just a short time ago, the first towns where a communal movement made itself felt. The situation became particularly difficult after the death of William I, the Conqueror, in 1087, because he left the Duchy of Normandy to his eldest son, Robert de Courteuse, and the kingdom to his second son, William II the Red. This says more about the geopolitical importance of these two regions to William I than about his family preferences, I think. In any case, his sons did not think alike. Robert did not accept the division and rebelled against his brother. And he was supported in his rebellion by Otho, Bishop of Bayeux, his uncle, half-brother of William I, who probably resented the division of the duchy from the kingdom. William II knew to suppress his brother's revolt, who then embarked on the crusade, leaving the duchy in William's care. This situation gave Helias, Count of Le Mans, the opportunity to get his hands on the city of Le Mans. But he was beaten and imprisoned by the king, who took the city back, reducing it almost entirely to ashes. The situation became even more complex after the unexpected death of William II during a hunt. Power in England was immediately taken by the conqueror's youngest son, Henry. But he had to face his elder brother as soon as Robert returned from the crusade in 1101. Things calmed down more or less with Robert's imprisonment in 1106 and Henry giving Le Mans in fief to Helias. Things were also changing very quickly in the church, as we have been hearing also yesterday. The movement known as the Gregorian Reformation was really beginning to take hold. One point that was particularly targeted was the celibate and chaste life of the highest dignitaries. We shall see what this meant for Hildebert's ecclesiastical and literary career. The 11th century not only saw changes in major political and religious institutions. Social and societal life changed completely. For our purposes now, the most important change was the rise in school enrollment. Literacy increased to an unprecedented degree since many centuries. And so schools became cultural and social centers to be reckoned with. And this was not just a movement of growth. The approach to learning changed. In schools, the advance of dialectical thinking had far-reaching consequences for the way the old disciplines were taught. What was being taught began to be deconstructed, with a huge impact on teaching, writing, reading, and the appreciation of what and how teaching had to be done. I just give you one example of a poem that, whenever mentioned in scholarship, is dismissed. Oh, apparently I wanted to give you, but apparently it fell once again out of my PowerPoint. So I will skip this example, of course. But there is a small example of a poem. It's that might have shown you how strong deconstruction was become in teaching. But anyway, I will go to the next part. Just leaving this for a moment, okay. Students were looking for the most accomplished masters of these new techniques and approaches. Those masters who knew how to attract large numbers of students gave luster to their schools and thus to the cathedrals with which these schools were linked. Similar masters could aspire to be noticed and to be chosen for higher positions. Okay, Hildebert's career must be seen in the context of a world that was changing at high speed, and that required a great deal of diplomacy to hold its own and to shape a career that depended entirely on secular powers on the one hand, but that was increasingly feeling the pressure of the reformers in the church on the other. The first thing to cause wonder is how the bishop of a city so important in the struggles and battles of the time could have retired to his country house to give himself over to the leisure of literary creation. Even more so after being consecrated archbishop, and therefore considered to be taking an active part in the reformation of the church. Now, this is the image that biographers have given of Hildebert. It was in the countryside, at Ivry-l'Évêque, whose villa he had rebuilt, that Hildebert liked to retire to cultivate the muses. He divided his time between short verses imitating Ovid and more serious compositions, such as extracts from sentences, the lives of the saints, and the letters of direction he addressed to his penitents. Such were Hildebert's noble leisurely activities, interspersed with the travel required by his office. That was Dieudonné. Von Moos then. Hildebert's literary talent was famous before he became bishop, and probably contributed to his becoming bishop in 1096. Apparently, against his will, he ascended to the cathedra after Howell's death. What he lacked in terms of origin and the politics of authority, he replaced with what his biographer considered to be the main reason for his rise: education and an attractive appearance. I hope all of you see that what we are having, and I'm not saying anything bad about von Moos, because the work is a classic, and it is one of the greatest and most influential works working on this personality and this writing. And it, as I said, it has been very important in defining the Renaissance of 12th century. But let's go and try to find something to put Hildebert's literary activity back into the time that it is. Because the quotation from von Moos does tell us something about it. Hildebert's literary talent probably contributed indeed to his becoming a bishop. I mentioned earlier that Hildebert himself had a hand in the composition of several collections of his own works. This is true, for example, for the first letter collection, in which Hildebert presents himself as a spiritual teacher who gives guidance to the more important figures of his time, as Henry I of England and his wife Mathilde. He advises or consults masters of the school, like William of Champeaux and Anselm of Canterbury. These letters earned him the praise of all his biographers, his modern biographers, I have to say, as the balanced humanist avant la lettre. Nobody seemed to wonder why he did not include his many letters to Eve of Chartres. And we know that he consulted Eve very often, thanks to Eve's answers, and that these letters almost always concerned practical and juridical problems. We also know that Hildebert had an intense and heated correspondence with Geoffrey of Vendôme, abbot of St. Trinity. The abbot accused Hildebert of mismanagement, of impotence and unwillingness, of being a very bad example of a bishop. Now, in all modern biographies, Geoffrey is depicted as the overheated troublemaker, to whom Hildebert opposes his calmness and humanness. I will leave the decision to decide between both of them to you after having finished this paper. Hildebert also composed at least 2 collections of his own poetical works. I don't know if I don't think. I'm sorry, I've been working the whole morning to get some slides back on my PowerPoint that went lost somewhere on the travel. And from the hotel to here, apparently I lost them again. So that's why I'm a little bit confused in this. But anyway, it's no problem. So the smaller one that Hildebert composed, in the smaller one, the poems were ordered in a way to group themselves around some fundamental elements in the life of a Christian bishop: chastity and church versus world. The bigger one, the bigger composition that Hildebert composed himself, or that was composed under his supervision anyway, was unfortunately destroyed by the Allied bombing of Tours. But we have a very accurate description and an edition of its entire content. It depicts even more clearly the life course of a model bishop, showing remarkable parallels to a similar collection by his older friend and colleague, Marbot of Rennes. When considering similar carefully constructed autobiographical reflections, that is, reflections on his own life, and also the attempts to rewrite them, and I will return to this, the question, of course, arises for whom Hildebert was taking such pains. On whom did he aim his poetical weapons? To speak with Pasolini, of whom I took the quotation in my title. As we have said, it's not easy to date Hildebert's poems, but there are a few that can be placed before his appointment as a bishop. There are two short poems addressed to two bishops of great influence in the court of Normandy. One of them, William of St. Clair, who just before 1100 was exiled from England and was actually advising the brother of William II, Robert de Courteuse. And the other one is Odon of Bayeux. Both died between 1096 and 1097. The poems, therefore, must have been written before, and that is exactly the period preceding Hildebert's appointment, or, even more likely, the turbulent period that followed his election and appointment as a bishop of Le Mans. Hildebert's election to the episcopal see was not without resistance. Hildebert was clearly the favorite of his predecessor Hoel, but also Hoel had problems of being accepted. Both came from outside and were imposed by the feudal lords. Apparently, they were the candidates of the Dukes of Normandy. For Hoel, this was still the conqueror. But for Hildebert, everything became much more complicated. His verses to William and Odon suggested he relied mainly on the Duke and therefore on Robert de Courteuse. However, Robert de Courteuse was in these years departing for the Crusades, leaving Hildebert without a protector immediately after his election. Undoubtedly, this was the reason why Hildebert came to William first and then Odo with verses and the gift. Perhaps he did not know that Odo would follow Robert, or perhaps Hildebert thought that even from a distance the voice of the conqueror's half-brother would suffice. In any case, it's clear that Hildebert indeed realized what he lacked in terms of origin and the politics of authority, as von Moos puts it. So he sought the support of influential ecclesiastics among the secular powers, and he knew he could achieve it through poetry. The two poems are similar in their puns and witticism towards the end, as you can see. The poem to Odon is the more telling, because it seems unlikely that Hildebert, as an archdeacon, had the means to send the wealthy and kingly bishop a gift that might seduce Odon. Hildebert probably, if the ring is really sent by Hildebert, I will turn to this later, Hildebert probably made use of the treasures of the Church of Le Mans, which is not a compliment, of course. If the image of the ring should be taken as an allusion, the image of the ring can also be taken, I must say, as an allusion to his own election as a bishop, of course, thus in which he thus offers his support to Odon in exchange, of course, for the bishop's support, which is also possible. Two other poems can be dated before Hildebert's appointment, because they are mentioned by Baudry, abbot of Bourgueil, in one of his own poems, to Hildebert. Baudry sent this poem to Hildebert, who was still archdeacon. He addresses him as an archdeacon. They thus predate his elevation to the episcopal see. One of these poems is a funeral eulogy on Berengar of Tours, the famous or infamous instigator of the first Eucharistic controversy. Hildebert's poem, of which you see here some fragments, it's a very long poem. It's an epithalamium, but you could rather call it a funerary ode, because it really has almost a hymnic character. Hildebert's poem is most striking in that it makes no single allusion to this theological conflict for which Berengar, of course, was mostly known. Hildebert does, however, praise the master as a champion of justice, of humility, and of chastity. The discrepancy with Berengar's publicly known personality, Berengar was dead for a few years, actually several years, is so great and so glaring that it's difficult to take this poem as really as an expression of gratitude or respect for the master, as it is normally interpreted. Hildebert is very often seen as a pupil of Berengar, but there are very little and very few, actually there are none, elements that prove that point to it, that indicate it. The end, notably, cannot be taken for granted. Just look at you see the last lines. But Hildebert says, actually, he speaks about Berengar, a man truly wise and in every sense blessed, whose soul enriches heaven, whose body the earth. May after death I live with him and rest with him, and may my fate not be better than his fate. I'm sorry, I cannot believe that Hildebert is wishing the same fate as Berengar. Does anyone believe this? Being condemned for heterodoxy, being forced to live outside society, to suffer the pains of inner defeat. When you read the last writings of Berengar, you read a suffering man, a really suffering man. Now, Hildebert is not a suffering person in that sense. It seems clear to me that what Hildebert wanted above all to do is to evoke the image of an ideal master as the model to which he himself aspired. It is above all a visiting card to present himself, albeit directly in an exemplary way. Now, of course, why should you then take someone like Berengar? Because the image you evoke of Berengar is that untrue, it's not that unfactly true, you would say, is thus opposing reality of what everyone sees, that everyone knows he's not talking about Berengar. And so they're looking immediately a little bit further. And he couldn't say this about himself, of course. So he's doing it in an indirect way. Now, the other poem that Baudry mentions attacks three vices. No, that's for later, I will come. Three vices: love, rather woman, avarice and ambition. Avarice and ambition were the real dangers, of course, for higher dignitaries. The first had become paramount in the atmosphere of the Reformation. The verses on women and avarice repeat many topical themes, while those on ambition are completely original and innovative. But they are not the poetic exercises of a master who retires into silence. They are just as clear preparation for Hildebert's elevation. A master and a poet who attacks these three vices with such violence as Hildebert does in this poem cannot be suspected of having been guilty of them, can he? His opponents were not convinced. They accused him of having fathered a population of sons and daughters in a whole series of young women. And Hildebert would not have done so in reckless youth, but after he had been promoted to the archdeaconry. So when he was considered fully adult and responsible for the purity of his office. His opponents directed the accusation not at anyone, but at Yves, Bishop of Chartres, the most esteemed champion of the Reformation. Yves asked Hildebert in one of his letters not to accept the office of bishop if these rumors were true. Yves himself didn't want to judge. Dieudonné, as a biographer, cites several documents that spoke of one or more of Bishop Hildebert's sons being given charges. And there's some discussion, of course, if those sons are spiritual sons or if they are natural sons. But seeing the letter of Yves, we can suppose the second part. Hildebert then was guilty not only in the view of the time of unchastity, but also of simony. Hildebert therefore needed to purify himself, and he succeeded. Von Moore's biography makes no further mention of his amorous escapades. But can it still be considered fortuitous that he wrote his life of Mary of Egypt, the life of a nymphomaniac who converts and who then lives a life of penitence, that he wrote his life exactly at this period, around his election and immediately following it? And his frequent consultations of Yves will have aimed at giving the influential bishop a more positive view on his colleague. Hildebert must have concealed many other acts. We have seen that he was punished by William the Red and that he lived in exile in England for a few months. He was able to return to Le Mans very quickly, after a couple of months actually. And no doubt with the king's consent and probably with considerable financial resources. The king ordered him to destroy one of the cathedral's towers because it had been used against his troops during the siege of Le Mans in 1099. Hildebert met with great resistance from his chapter, who refused to obey to the king's orders. Hildebert apologized in a letter to the king. This has always been interpreted by his scholarly biographers as him trying to buy time. A theory that does not seem very likely, I think, because how could he have known that the king would die in a few months? And William the Red did not accept the rebellion of his bishops, as Hildebert had already experienced. Moreover, is the coincidence that Hildebert, in this difficult situation where he saw himself threatened from all sides, decided to undertake a trip to Rome and then continued to Sicily. And he was away for almost a year. William II had died. The political situation was once again becoming difficult and unpredictable. Hildebert could be accused of having worked for the dead king. He wrote a poem that he included in all the collections that he composed himself. The poem, On the Fate of This World, describes his confrontation with William as the confrontation with a true and real tyrant who destroyed all the rights of the bishop and therefore of the church. Now, after all we've heard, you don't need any more explanations, I think. We're dealing with a phenomenon that all too often eludes historians and contemporaries alike: self-excuse, and by means that are nonetheless well known. 20th century saw this with many former Nazis and collaborators, for example, after the war, who were suddenly all silent resistance fighters. Very silent indeed. Or we may think of the image of Albert Speer, the good Nazi. But this phenomenon, very understandable in itself, plays an important role in history too, and historians have almost never taken it into account. Think of Pliny the Younger or Tacitus, who both knew a brilliant career under Domitian, but blackened him in their writings in order to purify themselves. And they succeeded, whenever you read history books on Domitian. Now, Hildebert is one of those self-excusers. He too was able to make his mark on history, less by denigrating others, with the exception of William II, than by creating his own image, the image of a model bishop, a cultured writer, a man who charms with his education and his attractive appearance, a man steeped in ancient culture who stayed away from the political tumult of his time to devote himself entirely to his poetic pastimes. In short, a man who lived a life to which every man of modern culture aspires. And we have here, as Benjamin Paul has talked about yesterday, we have here the embodiment of cultural capital, but actually, I think rather of cultural capital of our times, reprojected onto the past. In reality, Hildebert stood in the middle of his time. He was obliged to fight accusations, to purify himself from the faults of his previous accent years. Now, this all-too-human aspect of his personality is smoothened by historians, but it comes to the fore by reading his texts not as historical sources, and neither as the fruits of leisure, but as part and parcel of living your life in a concrete world. My approach does not limit itself to just this single case of Hildebert. Hildebert was a master and a much-loved teacher. He had students and colleagues who behaved in the same way. The art of dissimulation became a literary force in what historians have called the 12th century Renaissance. But rarely they have been able to unmask it. For me, one of the most notorious examples is the case of Abelard and Heloise. No one ever wanted to see how Abelard's autobiography was modeled on well-chosen models. And the same applies to Heloise's letters, one of which takes almost literally the words of Mary the Egyptian from the life that Hildebert wrote. Now, as you know, Heloise became something of an icon for the female voice in the Middle Ages. And what can you do when all this voice really does is to reproduce the voice of a literary model written by men? I hope you see the difficulties. To unmask literary dissimulation, historians need literary scholars, just as literary scholars need historians to prevent them reading pre-modern texts as if they were written today. I thank you. Inside.
Dunque, thank you very much. That was perfect, also perfectly under time. Anche qui.
Special thanks. We finished this first part before the break 5 minutes earlier, so this does not mean that we have a 20-minute break, because we want to have some time for the discussion. So please come back at 5:10. And so I ask the next speaker to speak at 5:10. Thank you.
English manuscript.
Oh.
As the Coton Tiberius.
Cool. Oh, right.
Yeah, from the
Cool.
11th century. I will not speak about England, but
Comincia. Si ricomincia.
Okay, let's resume. I have the honor to introduce Lxxi Wilkham, who will introduce the part on the economic history.
11th century in northwestern Europe. Over to you, Lxxi.
thank you, Chris. So I will speak in English while I'm French speaking normally. So I'm not a native speaker. I do apologize for the mistakes I'm going to do. I would like also to thank, of course, very warmly the organizer for the honor of being invited here. So I've been asked to present an overview of the European economy in the 11th century. This request at the beginning was very generous but daunting, and so I have reduced the topic of my paper to more modest dimensions. If still unreasonable dimension by concentrating on northwestern Europe and in fact mostly on the southern Low Countries, while daring to expand a little bit my perspective and borrowing examples from areas surrounding these. So the 11th century is no longer considered to be an abrupt turning point, at least from the point of view of economic life for northwestern Europe. So I do not have to insist upon the very old views of Henri Pirenne, despite the fact that they are very influential still, even for romantic reasons for Belgian historians. I will not elaborate much about something which has been very much discussed these last hours, about the Duby account of a break of the feudal mutation, but however, I will still have to discuss the question of lordship. I try to avoid that, but it's impossible. And finally, as an anecdote, I shall only mention very quickly, and in fact not insist upon the new debate we already started to discuss about the possible Gregorian turning point as a pivotal moment in the recomposing of medieval history, because this periodization, as one of its author, Florian Mazel, even admits, is less relevant to economic history, at least for the 11th century. So Chris' lecture yesterday and mostly his book, The Donkey and the Boat, can help us to think about northwestern Francia. According to him, the 11th century was the moment when the kind of commercial revolution which drove several Mediterranean regions became visible. This revolution was linked to pre-existing intra-regional dynamics, the driving forces behind needs, however, to be identified. Interregional or international trade in luxury goods is not one of them. Chris suggests that trade links regions which have already experienced a kind of internal growth in the first place, and so commerce at best adds to the pre-existing dynamism and prosperity. It does not create it. So identifying the drivers of growth, of course, is not a very easy task. We already discussed that a little bit in the morning. And it's not the same as making a list of the symptoms. And so, for example, demographic growth is more of an indicator than a real cause in itself. And as a provocation, I will use a sentence written by Guibois, completely out of fashion, Guibois, but however, I think that this paragraph is interesting. I translate that in English. You have the original sentence on the screen. Europe was swept along by a growth movement of exceptional scope and duration. Beginning under the Carolingian, it accelerated in the 11th and 12th centuries and reached its peak towards the middle of the following century. No satisfactory interpretation of such a considerable historical phenomenon has been put forward. The medieval boom has been described many times, but never explained. It remains an enigma. For the demographic argument cannot be taken as the ultimate explanation. A demographic surge, even a strong long-term one, is not enough to ensure the development of a society. If the economy doesn't keep up, a few famines or epidemics will soon bring about the inevitable adjustments. And so, Chris Wickham's attempts to explain the Ancien Régime economy from other perspective, which he believes to be valid, and it makes maybe possible to overcome the stalemate observed by Bois. And among the factors which paved the way for economic takeoff and the condition for commercialization, Chris identifies above all, he didn't really discuss that yesterday, but peasant economic agency or demand. And he concludes his book by inviting us to take hold of his feudal model of economic growth. So it's, however, difficult to respond to the research agenda he suggested, because explanatory models for the northwestern Europe are lacking. Even for Flanders, which is still a very dynamic, academically speaking, area for medieval economic history, but colleagues are mostly dealing for the late Middle Ages. So it doesn't mean that history has come to a standstill. The accumulation of new archaeological material is making it possible to relaunch the historical narrative. And the review I'm going to propose is therefore not exhaustive and will be structured as follows. I will try to include the 11th century in a longer sequence, pointing to recent study which confirm of nuance some paradigms by looking at climate, population growth, food production, crisis, the political resolution, land distribution, peasant demand in the market, and the place of towns. Of course, I will have to go quite quickly to address all of these issues. I cannot avoid, in the first time, a kind of Brodelian confrontation between the social organization on the one hand and a kind of environmental variables. There's no need to remind you that climate, while has been almost unmentioned until now, is a dominant explanation for some historians. And so it's impossible to speak about the 11th century without remaining that the last few decades refined a Lamb climate model, which was already developed, in fact, in the 1960s. And so it suggests that there was a kind of medieval climatic optimum, which is dated, which starts at 900 or 950 and would theoretically have lasted until 1250 or 1350, after which a gradual cooling would have taken place. I will not insist upon the technical variables which could be of influence upon this trend. I could quote quickly solar variation in solar radiation, maybe volcanic eruptions which could have affected the variability. But what I would like to, and so it leads to a different type of atmospheric pressure over the North Atlantic Ocean, and so leading maybe to increase in winter temperature that are sometimes substantial, with warming of between 1 to 3 degrees. But what I would like to say is use Jean-Pierre Devroy and Preiser Kapler's very recent remark, because I'm using an article which has been published 2 weeks away. So, he tells us, both tell us, and Preiser Kapler elaborate elaborates a lot about that, in fact, we need to be very careful about this idea of the 11th century being inserted in a positive trend, because there was a lot of variation even during this warm period. First, that we do use a lot of dendrochronological data, and these have been used for the graph you're seeing there, but in fact these data are very locally sensitive, so making a huge model for that is quite a problem. And finally, because there was a period during this so-called warming period, which has been, as it seems, very cold, and it's the 1050 or 1080, which means a large portion potentially of the 11th century. So we cannot, as I will tell very quickly, use the climate as a kind of deus ex machina to understand exactly the growth of the high Middle Ages. I mentioned very quickly also the fact that Preiser Kepler told us that there are many interrogations among specialists of the Byzantine world, because some of them are trying to use climate as an explanation for growth or for decline, because they have very diverging interpretation. And his conclusion is that we need more data. We can get rid of this kind of deterministic overview, and it brings us back, of course, to the question of the actors and the society. And I would like now to discuss with you the second point, the question of the demographic boom or evolution. So it has been a long time that early medievalists, in fact, working on the early Middle Ages, Pierre Toubert, Adrien Verhulst, for example, Jean-Pierre Devroy also, and many more, discussed the question of the beginning of the early medieval growth, which was preceding the 11th century. And so there was a narrative which included the demographic growth. And for instance, Jean-Pierre, for example, used the Polyptyque de Reims to prove that there was in 2 generations an almost doubling of the population, with accident, of course. So there are other types of data which are used to document this growth, and these are, of course, the archaeological and paleoscientific items. I will come back upon that. Demography in itself, however, is not the only way to document and to qualify this growth. We can discuss that, because the word growth in itself is a disputable word, and it's not only the question of demography which needs to be addressed. I come back to my text. Of course, the problem is the quantification of this demographic growth. We do not have absolute numbers in many cases, and so we need to rely upon, for the early Middle Ages as well as for the later periods, to other types of documentation, like proxies indicator coming from palynology, carpology, and studies of the archaeological terroir. But we need to aggregate that type of indicator, which is not that easy. We do not have on the northwestern Europe, continental Europe, the equivalent of Helena Hamro's project, Feeding the Saxon, which aggregates a lot of data and which at least could provide a much precise picture of this. So you know, of course, and we will come back to that in a few minutes, that the problem to document this growth is of course because of the scarcity of the written documentation. For example, I show you here the relative distribution of charters for Belgium. You can see that between the 11th and the 12th century, the 12th century being in green, you have a crazy multiplication of evidence available. So it explains why we have to use the paleoscientific indices to document these moves. of course, as I told you, we do not have an extensive synthesis of these, lacking a comparative data. We can, however, use a few samples here and there of studies. For example, studies made in the town of Laval in the Mayenne region of France reveals the gradual creation of an open landscape to the detriment of the forest in very precise way. And we can see the different stages. During the first Carolingian expansion, livestock farming was first modest, but cereal farming developed in a very significant way. The continuous expansion in the 11th century is reflected in the presence of grasses and cyperaceae, which are evidence of the existence of meadows, probably linked also to the development of livestock farming, in addition to an ever-growing cereal growing system, which finally declined at the beginning of the 12th century. At the same time, hemp growing, perhaps in a family setting, was also developing. And also, it should be noted that deforestation has been linked by the authors with the expansion of some craft industries, the work of metal, for example, of glass, also, which are heavily wood-consuming. We have similar, of course, examples close to Flanders. You have the references here of the study conducted by my friend Wim de Klerk and other colleagues, close to Aardenburg and Houdenburg, when you can see a very significant extension of cereal growing and grazing areas, especially in the 11th and 12th century. In Lorraine, also, the 11th century sees the reclamation of forests, the creation of the damming of valleys to create ponds to supply fish, for example, and there is a real process after the middle of the 11th century of anthropization of the landscape with a strong pressure on it. I could multiply the example. There are other ones from the Loire-Atlantic regions. The problem, of course, is that we have separate data, and it's still too precocious to use these to provide a general synthesis, but many of them, however, go in the same direction at least. So if archaeology is to be believed, and its new technique, demographic expansion found in a new natural environment that was not yet completely full and which was conducive to expansion. And so this expansion was a possible way to mitigate the potential Malthusian tension between population and food production, of course, which is always the debated question about demographic growth and its positive or negative effects on economy. And I will mention by the side that we do find, even in the 11th century, very interesting mentions in charters. This is a charter from l'Abbaye de Marchienne around the middle of the 11th century, which proves already there is a kind of consciousness of the danger on the surrounding forest. There's already oppression on these forests, and so it regulates the use and the possibility to cut trees in a quite strict way to advantage especially the hospices of the abbey in this surrounding. It's interesting because usually we are more keen to place later that kind of restriction of the use of wood, and it's kind of a protection of the natural resources because of the expansion of population. So, are things that clear? However, no, because medievalists still face a number of problems, in fact, when they are discussing about this possible expansion of population and expansion of reclamations. We may have more land available to more people. It doesn't mean that, in fact, hunger doesn't appear. It has been written recently, especially in the Nouvelle Histoire du Moyen Âge, that there were no more food crisis in the 11th century. Obviously, it's not true. It's not true, at least in some area. And despite the possible positive climatic trend, and we saw that it was not that easy to prove. In fact, we know that even if food is largely available, it doesn't mean that people do have access to food. It has been proven by the Nobel Prize Amartya Sen in a very different surrounding. And so this is called the entitlement theory. I will not elaborate a lot about that, but it means that food can be available, but people do not have access to it. So the question of hunger still is a real question. It's a real question also for the 11th century. I can show you, for example, this graph which has been made by a former student, doctoral student of mine. It's now published in his dissertation, and it's a list of the different famines in the Low Countries collected from the narrative sources. Of course, there is always the risk of the distribution of sources we already discussed, but still it shows that at the beginning and at the end of the 11th century, they are very, and in the middle, likely, they are very severe food crises which happened and which are documented in many sources. So the question is, how were these type of crises managed? We do not have many sources to document this trend and this problem, and so we have only narrative sources in the 11th century, especially Gesta Episcoporum or Gesta Abbatum. And so it could be that there is a bias because of this distribution of sources, and we have to be very careful about that. However, we see mostly that, especially in the Germanic sources in the bishopric of Liège or in Cologne, in the Archbishop of Cologne, we can see that bishops are involved into the helping of the people starving and taking what we would call economical policies, public economical policies, distributing food, trying to avoid speculation and maybe to protect the poorer people. Royal power was involved into that kind of measure in the Carolingian times, as Jean-Pierre Devroy showed, at least in a programmatic way. Royal power vanished from the sources according to this. Maybe you have in Elgaud de Fleury, the life of Robert the Pious, some mention about its charity toward the poor, but you cannot see a real systematic policy in trying to avoid hunger and famine. And you have to wait for the beginning of the 12th century to have a more elaborate investment of lay powers, like the Count of Flanders, Charles le Bon, in the very well and very famous famine in the beginning of the 12th century, to see back an intervention of the lay power. So it's maybe a question of sources, so we have to be quite careful about that. But however, in the Germanic world, for example, the king doesn't appear at all in the 11th and 12th century narratives about relieving these people. And sometimes, too, you can see very punctual intervention of abbots trying to relieve and help the poor people, but it looks more like a kind of paternalism directed toward the monastery familia than a real general politics helping to relieve the poor. I come to my next point, the question, something which has been discussed already a lot, but it's important, is about the question of the circulation of land and especially the top-down process in the economical growth, and something which has been already discussed this morning and will be discussed tomorrow, also the king's fiscus and its contribution. This is another factor to the economic growth. I just don't have to insist because Maria Elena already mentioned that there were interesting patterns in some area, especially the Middle Meuse Valley, when you can see a continuous presence of the king, for example, who has still a lot of estates along the Meuse until very late in the 12th century. And we have to rethink about this possible contribution to the economic growth of the area, which indeed knew some kind of economic boom at the end of the early Middle Ages and in the 11th and 12th century. At least some of this land was given to the church and helped the city of Liège, for instance, to grow and to become an important economical and political player in the 11th and 12th century. And it's largely connected to the connection to fiscus, which is definitely an important factor. I would like to invite my colleague in France, because I'm not, of course, I do not have the skills and competence to do that, to maybe repay attention also to the distribution of the royal land close to Paris, which has been studied a long time ago by Newman and a little bit by Le Marinier, because it's maybe interesting to see this constellation of estates, as mentioned by Rolf Gross in a very interesting article 15 years away, who compared the Ottonians with the early Capetians and trying to show that the early Capetians were not that weak as was previously talked, and maybe it could be related also to the growth of Paris with this constellation of center of power close to Senlis, Compiègne, Paris, Orléans, and so on. But I have to say that I do not have the skill to go in deep upon that. Finally, there are interesting issues that should be discussed, but I do not have the time to discuss that, is the question to go above and beyond what has been discussed, I would say in a provocative manner, ad nauseam with Cluny about the gift and counter-gift and anthropological logic behind the economical circulation in monasteries, because there are many other types of transactions which are still existing outside of Cluny, and we have to remind us that Cluny, of course, is very important and spectacular, but there are the classical canon chapters, which are also important, cathedrals, old Benedictine abbeys, which are still existing in the 11th century, and which in aggregate way probably outweigh even the question of the Cluniac question, I would say. So I will now focus mainly upon a very important point, which has been already raised, but not finally developed that much, is the question of the economic influence of lordship upon the economical growth in the 11th century. So Alessio discussed that a little bit in the morning, but in fact I have to say that I'm not that satisfied with the existing models still discussed by now, and I think that works needs still to be done, especially about the question of the peasant's position in the 11th century. We discussed a lot the question of continuity, of the feudal break, and the emergence of lordship, which is obviously important, and I do agree that, for example, Dominique Barthélemy helped us to free us from a very and too rigid canvas according to which we were reading the year 1000, and as also the economic boom of the 11th century. I have to say too that the problem is that we need to reassess, in fact, deeply the question of the peasant agency in the 11th century. Their aggregate economic weight, and also the possibility for them to contribute or not to the overall economical boom. I can quote quickly a very interesting recent work from Nicolas Carriès, for example, on servitude, which extended Dominique Barthélemy's view, and he proved, for example, that maybe from the exterior, especially from above and from the church view, all people working to maybe in the fields were aggregated to as servants, and so because there was a kind of despise of their condition, because they were understood very badly as a kind of negative vision of effort. And he quotes in a very recent article, interesting, Ratier de Verona, Adalbéron de Lan, for example. However, I do agree with Laurent Feller that finally the question of the servile status, it's maybe from an economic point of view, what's important is the productive function and the burden wearing upon the peasants' shoulders, and which is something we have to deal with. So we have to take this problem according to two perspectives. As Chris already mentioned, especially in the book, finally, not really in his talk yesterday, we have to look maybe at the issue of whether the peasants lived well and had the possibility to profit a bit of their activity wherever it took place. And so we cannot be quite sure about that, especially since 30 years, because there have not been many studies upon that topic of the well-being of the peasants, especially in the context of lordship in northwestern France and Flanders, Namurois, and so on, since the classical world of Verhulst, Génicot, and so on. I have to mention that scholars dealing with the early Middle Ages tried to give a more nuanced picture of the stratification, inner stratification of the peasant society these last years. I could mention Juan Castillo, Jean-Pierre Devroy, Laurent Feller, Nicolas Schröder, Thomas Heer, and many others who tried to show that in fact there was a kind of inner stratification and diversity even amongst peasants, at least until the end of the 10th century. So nothing comparable has been undertaken now in the recent year, and this is, however, a crucial question. We have still to ask the classical question of the freestanding peasant in the 11th and 12th century. I know it's a very classical question, but it is not solved, maybe because, of course, of the difficulties of documentation. We especially maybe have to discuss the paradigm which links the growth of the Central Middle Ages to the increase of taxation on peasant labor. As we mentioned, it could be that this takeoff of the 11th century is a kind of consequence of the increase, or at least a large number of demands by lords. But finally, it is not really proved. More specific questions remain also. We can see that as far back as the 10th century, some peasants of several monasteries in Reims, Gorze, Saint-Vanne were demanding already a hand to the kind of arbitrary rule of the monastic lords by asking that levies be limited to and predictable. So is this an indication of the economic and political clout? What effect did these concessions have on their life? What to think about the status of hospites in the 11th century, who enjoyed rights over tenure, pieces of land carved out of woods in secular or monastic seigneuries, subject to conditions that were not overwhelming, finally, despite the obligation to use the mill, the seigneur, the lordly mill. What to say also about the fact that some free people, or maybe freed people, which is not the same thing, as Dominique Barthélemy already showed, start to ask to enter as serfs in the familia of a monastery. So what can we think about that? Because in Belgium especially, a large number of charters and the diplomatic documentation in the 11th century is connected to this trend. But we have, of course, an overwhelming and important document which starts already in the middle of the 10th century and which is the Liber Traditionum from St. Peter of Ghent. However, as Dominique Barthélemy showed, the well-furnished dossier of Marmoutier showed that many of these people were, in fact, ministeriales and not maybe peasants. So, can we postulate that it's better to live under a crozier? Of course, we have seen ecclesiastical seigneuries where maybe places where abuses were sometimes limited, but we have to make some nuance, even about the question of the typical and very important fate of the large estate, the so-called Carolingian estate, which is what we could call an ideal type, as Pierre Toubert already said. And so it means this type of structures has been for a long time postulated to decay, but in fact we can see at the end of the 10th and at the beginning of the 11th century that some monasteries are going back to this structure and introducing bonework back around the year 1000 and later or a little bit before. So we cannot say that living in a monastic seigneury was necessarily more easy than living elsewhere. And we can see a real diversity in the condition of the people, even being neighbors. I will not insist also on something Mathieu Arnoux mentioned in a synthesis about the impact of the possible charity display in the countryside according to the display and the use of tithes in the 11th century, because we have not that much sources. But he suggests, and I think it's clever, it's not proven, but it is clever, however, to suggest that tithes could have been used to relieve and to help in a temporary way very poor workers still staying in the countryside and providing, for example, ad hoc help rather in walking or during the harvests. And so this kind of structural or punctual help maybe help them to stay in the countryside and providing an extra of work without fleeing to the booming towns. So in short, and that's really important, we have to recognize the diversity of peasant status, sometimes within the same institution, and sometimes it seems on the scale of the same terroir. And we need to track the inner diversity of the peasant society, even along the lordship. And we need to look at the different indices pointing at the economic involvement of some peasants, for example, the use of credit and the use of mortgage, which appear again in the beginning of the 11th century, also in the countryside. So we have to be more precise, to exactly evaluate the peasant agency in the 11th century before saying that's because of the Lord Haskins. I will go very quickly, because I have only less than 10 minutes to finish, about some very important also questions, the birth of the rural and urban markets. In fact, I have not real new things, questions to raise upon that topic, so I can remind you Mathieu Arnoux' remarks, for instance, who at least show that documentation starts to boom about this creation, which does not mean, of course, that there were no early medieval markets in the countryside earlier, but still we can see these in the charters. Again, it is maybe a question of révélation rather than révolution, but at least the sources do point these in the text. What's interesting, however, in these documents are much more elaborate and precise than what we have for the Carolingian or post-Carolingian times earlier, because we have very specific regulations which point and which are very detailed about the fairness of the market, the banum or the monopoly of sales by abbeys or bishop, the infrastructures and maybe the first rural structures such as the halles, for example. And so Arnaud uses a lot of examples from Normandy, but we have many types of examples, for example, in Flanders, and we have also in Flanders the first fairs, these not weekly, but these famous fairs which are aligned onto the religious calendar. I would like finally to insist about the markets, about the interest of paying attention to the first toll tariff we do have in the 11th century in Arras, for example, in around 1046, which is very interesting because it helps us to point at the circulation not only of prestigious goods, but maybe more cereals, cheese, wine, for example, fish, which are documented into these documents. Finally, I will only elaborate quickly about the question of urbanization, which is always, of course, an issue because the prime movers into the birth of early medieval town in the north have been heavily disputed. We made a lot of progress, and Adriaan Verhulst especially contributed a lot to this question by looking at the early medieval precondition for the urban growth and its connection to the booming local economy. In fact, it has been connected by many researchers, and archaeology now proves what was supposed initially as models by Verhulst and other Flemish scholars especially, that in some cases towns have a kind of connection with manorial history connected to the counts, to the different abbeys, or sometimes also for Valenciennes to royal estates, and in Tournai also. So it seems that there was a kind of multipolar dynamic which helped to provide at least an influx of goods toward polynuclear centers, which were the basis for the later economical growth. However, we need to document and to think a little bit more about maybe the way these proto-urban centers, even if I do not want to use a kind of theological way of addressing these, were evolving because we do not know exactly who were the first inhabitants. Verhulst suggested that many, in fact, of the first urban inhabitants were not that much people moving from the countryside to the city at first, but were rather the descendants of the first, I would say, I would not use the word serfs, but the word half-free or unfree people working on behalf of the counts, the kings, and the abbeys on the urban ground, and providing some kind of craft service, specialized craft service, or working as maybe tied merchants who were negotiating on behalf of the central or institutional power they were subjected to. And so he supposes that there was a kind of movement of freedom which came maybe due to the weakening of some institutions, sometimes the count, sometimes the abbeys, which helped these people to gain some new level of freedom and some agency and become new actors. Of course, there is also immigration, but these questions are, of course, difficult to document and rarely, by the way, addressed by the historians who are completely looking away when there is a debate about this question. So I have time just to conclude. So what is the answer of the initial question about the causality of the growth and the trade revolution? To be honest, I do not have any. Pedagogical simplification or the large major narratives in the last years in fact, and according to me, comes up against the complexity of economic phenomena. Can really the prosperity of the West currently be summed up by a single factor? A complex society, and I do think that 11th century society, even in the 11th century, is a complex society, requires elaborate narratives, even if we have to accept that they are less fashionable and legible. There is no reason to think, I think I have 2 minutes left. There is no reason to think that 11th society was less complex than all society or maybe early modern society. And so I think I have proved that climate, at least, is not a deus ex machina. Demographic growth is likely proven, but it needs to be more cleverly and more precisely assessed in connection with palynology and environmental science. If farmland expands, however, crisis is not absent, and the political and economic response is too fragile. Land movement can be considerable, but we have to document more precisely the different actors involved, and we need a better register of land movements. We need to think carefully about the economic action of players from the top and the bottom of society, and we need to think about the variety of the peasant condition and the possibility of them being actors for the economic growth. And the elucidation of market dynamics as to expect also, for example, to some publication, from some publication on monastery history, especially in France, which maybe will help us to renew our understanding of the dynamics of the rural market. And finally, the phenomena of urban growth are outstanding, but still need a more explanation, especially about the dynamic of the first inhabitants. In fine, the foregoing discussion has broadly placed the 11th century as a singular piece in a long sequence, marking a resumption of Carolingian growth. It will be difficult to isolate it completely from certain movements which sometimes began much earlier or at the end of the 10th century or begin later. Depending on the angle of analysis adopted, the sequences stand out, have their own rhythms. We will be remiss in the light of the study of economic phenomena that are often distended in time to single out the 11th century as a breaking point. I prefer siècle charnière. Even though it was also a crucible of changes which, to complicate the historian's task, were embodied with many nuances in space. Writing about the details of this movement requires a multiscalar analysis comparing local sources, sensitivities, documentary and social realities with the overall picture. Thank you.
That excellent and thought-provoking analysis of a topic that is very, very, very difficult to get your head around. And yet it's crucial. Right, can we have the other two speakers up to the front? Se potete tornare al palcoscenico e poi cominciamo.
and we can start the discussion. We have half an hour for the discussion, so more or less 10 minutes each.
Bene. Ecco Enrico, benissimo. Dunque, grazie. Dunque, cominciamo con la discussione della presentazione di...
So let's start with the discussion of Enrico Faini. Any questions?
Thomas Kohl. Enrico, I'm completely convinced by the Salustian origin of the consul. I really like that idea. I have one remark and I think two brief questions. One is, the remark is, you mentioned Anno of Cologne and Adalbert of Bremen as consules of the king, of the young king, as someone charged with, or in the role of someone of giving advice. Now that is, Henry is later heavily criticized for ignoring advice by those who are actually, whose role it actually is to provide advice, the princes, and he doesn't listen to them, he listens to other people. So you probably haven't looked into that, but it might be interesting to look if the word consules or something related is used there. My two questions. For the communio north of the Alps, an oath is essential, and my question is that not important in the south, in Italy? Is that not an issue? And related, the word conjuratio is used as a synonym in north of the Alps. Is that something that we can trace in Italy too? Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for this invitation. And of course, I welcome your invitation of analysis. As far as the Adamo di Brema topic is concerned, yes. The interesting thing is in the concilium, in my opinion. This is the main point, because the consulere and concilium go hand in hand, and sometimes concilius is there even though there are no consules. And as you indicated correctly, when we have this word, we may have a favorable environment for showing what we are interested into, so the shared power. So yes, thank you. And the second question is very important. Yes, you're right. I would enjoy the word consul as used by Goffredo Malaterra. I don't think it does it, but this is just an example. Generally speaking, I think that southern Italy was a mean for transmitting culture to the north and the Italic word. However, it is like more a feeling, not a deep conviction, because at the moment I didn't find a line to follow leading me towards this direction. Coniugatio is an important term, but it is an ambiguous term as well. However, it is an ambiguous term that is interesting, because of its ambiguity, of course, but it is also interesting because it is present in the most ancient models. So, for its big use, it should be handled with care. So in this phase of my research, I judged that too wide, so I didn't focus too much on it. But I will, for sure. Thank you very much. Anyone else? I see one hand raised. Thank you very much, Enrico, for your lecture, very beautiful lecture. It's not a question, but actually a remark on the use of consules in the word that I know the best. For the 10th century, and I made a brief analysis on the 11th century, I'm not that sure, the social connotation is not for aristocrats, but a medium urban level. Well-being, an active group present on public occasions, for sure, but also negotiators. But I will put them in the same group. I don't know if this can be useful for you because you carried out these wide analysis, so it was just an observation, just a remark. Thank you, Maria Elena, for this remark, which is very useful. And it is also new, because this comes from your research, unpublished research, so I will ask about it later on. However, it is really significant. It is a word applied to some wealthy actors participating in activities, so not necessarily aristocrats. So I think that these documentation is really useful. Thank you very much. Indeed. Any other questions? Very good. We move to the second lecture and the second lecturer. Who wants to intervene?
Thank you very much for the presentation, which I enjoyed greatly. And one thing that you drew attention to at the beginning of your paper was Hildebert's, can we say, control of the dissemination of his own works, particularly these little collections, these mini collections, these libelli, that he made quite deliberately by selecting a small number of his compositions each, and then basically transmitting them to individuals and certain groups. And I was wondering, because there's a very obvious parallel here to what Anselm does, and Samu Niskanen has worked a great deal on this, and I was wondering whether there might be value in furthering this comparison, and whether you can tell us just a bit more about how much active control Hildebert exercised over the early dissemination of his works, particularly thinking about this idea of making excuses, of redeeming himself actively from the reputation that he had acquired, which was a bad one. And it seems to me that controlling the publication of the works straight from the off in manuscript form might be key to resolving this issue of reputation.
Yes, thank you, Benjamin. I will answer you not in Flemish but in English because that's more comfortable, I think, for everyone to hear. Yes, and it is a problem, of course. It was a problem for Hildebert, it's a problem for us. The problem of Hildebert, of course, was that he probably tried to direct as much as possible as he could and control as much as possible as he, the addressees of who received those libelli, those small groups. But of course, he did not have, like Anselm, a monastic background and a monastic world. So he didn't have control of everything. It's very clear that, for example, it's not probably that Baudry of Bourgueil got this libelli with those poems into his hands probably was not intended by Hildebert, because Baudry was not that important for him. So there is probably, he didn't have this control, this entire control. And for that reason also, I think it's very important to see him trying to control the larger compositions. Because that he could control, because then you had more than just libelli, you had books. And books and manuscripts, of course, I don't want to talk about a book in the modern sense, book as a compositional unit, I want to say. Those you were not sending them around. They had to be lent, they had to be copied. It was much more controllable to what would happen with them. So there he was really controlling what was going into it and how it was going into it. But the smaller libelli, and that's one of the great problems that we have, of course that was his problem, but now our problem is that those small libelli, they ended up into anthologies, and all those huge anthologies, and which we have been working now for years and years and years on a project on what do we do with those anthologies of the 11th, 12th century. And because they are born suddenly in a huge amount, completely anonymous very often. So what is happening there? And in my book, I've been analyzing a few of those anthologies that clearly exist of similar libelli, not by Hildebert alone, some by poets that we know, many of them consisting of libelli of poets that we do not know at all. So they are circulating. It's a kind of, it has probably more to do with the new way of communication that is growing in that period, is because of communication by students, under masters and students, and that's not controllable, as we can see in the 12th century very clear, when heterodox elements are getting dispersed without the knowing of the persons. One of the masters who was reacting very aggressively against it is, for example, Gilbert de la Porree, who really says, I can't do anything but, about how students copy and take over my words and what they do with it. Whereas Hugo of Saint Victor, for example, controls every text that went out of his classroom. So you feel there is this problem coming, and they all know it. And even with Hugo of Saint Victor, of course, you're inside more or less monastic surroundings. I hope that's an answer to your question.
Ci sono altri che vogliono intervenire?
As a risky strategy? I mean, that Berengar poem is a risky strategy.
Yes.
Protecting your own. So what's going on there? I mean, it seems as though he has a very small, knowing audience in mind.
Yes.
And yet it goes out of his control. And did he not, what's behind that?
The poem
seems psychologically very strange.
Yes, the poem of Berengar is not only psychologically very strange, it is a risky game that he's doing there. But perhaps not that risky as we think, because perhaps Berengar was not that strongly condemned as we think he was, because he was still living and he was not enclosed, he was not imprisoned. He was just, he was living, he was capable of writing, he was capable of publishing. So perhaps we are looking at Berengar from a point of view that is much more, we see him as a much more risky person than perhaps he was in that period. So perhaps it was for Hildebert not a great risk to take him as an example. It has also, I must admit that from having been worked now for so many years on Hildebert and those poets, Hildebert was not someone to take risks, not at all. He was playing safe games, but he came all the time in troubles and problems because the situations around him were changing so quickly, and he was running behind the facts. And that made him sometimes choosing for rather, we would say, risky solutions, whereas in truth, probably he didn't want them to be risky. And that made me always doubting about this poem on Berengar, because Berengar indeed is a person with the way he is treated by Hildebert is so absurd. It's so far from reality. It's so far from everything we know that it really feels as if he's playing exactly with this. It's just that far from reality that you can't take it as being an eulogy for Berengar. So you have to take it as eulogy for someone else. But Hildebert would never write eulogy on himself. So you feel these kind of difficult choices those people, someone like Hildebert saw himself confronted with, and he was looking for solutions. It's not. I know it's not a very satisfying explanation what I give, but there you have the problems, I think, of touching upon the psychology of 11th century people is very difficult, and it's touching upon a way of behaving that is recognizable, but for that reason not understandable. And I think there we have we are at our limits for a part. So I know I'm not giving a satisfying answer, but it's the best I can give, I feel.
I'd like to intervene here myself. I was very struck when I was looking at the Libelli d'Elite of the same period, just slightly earlier, that one of the things that Gregory VII is accused of by imperial authors is being like Berengar of Tours. He's accused of being a heretic.
Yes.
He is like Berengar of Tours.
Yeah.
It's clearly one of the worst things that they can say about him.
Yes.
So it's not that Berengar is not a controversial character.
No,
but I also wonder whether that is because he's more controversial in the imperial lands than he is in France, and that people in France are not quite, that there isn't but the intellectual communication is incomplete here, and that the Berengar has different valences in different places.
I don't think so. I think he was very controversial also. It was controversial also in France. When I said that we have to be careful of seeing him as too risky, I just wanted to say that it was one of the possibilities. One of the possibilities that we could, because the problem is, of course, that also when we have people writing to Berengar or on Berengar, just a decade before Hildebert. Of course, you see that he's a controversial person, also in France, in what we call France nowadays. But the strange thing, perhaps, that I must say immediately also, so Baldry is reading this poem by Hildebert on Berengar. And what is he doing? He's writing an own poem on Berengar. It's very innocent and has nothing to say. It's not the same level of quality and of depth as it has with Hildebert. But so apparently it is also seen like a kind of poetical game. You can write poems on people you are not completely agreeing with, perhaps, people that are controversial. For Baldry, it is clearly as a game. You see it when you read a poem. It's just a playful poem. That doesn't say anything about the poem by Hildebert, but it shows that Hildebert's poem was not taken by everyone as a kind of as a dangerous poem. And it still doesn't solve the problem, and that indeed, I see this all the time. The poem on Berengar by Hildebert, which is interpreted by the entire modern historiographic tradition as showing that Hildebert was a pupil of Berengar and thus belongs to the more risky side, which there's no proof for this, not at all, and many people have criticized this. But it shows that there is this kind of consciousness of writing that makes perhaps those people, the contemporaries on the public to which Hildebert was writing, perhaps was more conscious about what writing is and how people were writing than we often are. It is one of the things that I'm very often struck by, is also when people start to you have letters that are destroying. People write letters to each other. You would say you would never see that. You would never want to see that person again. And still afterwards, you see that the context go on, because there is this kind of rhetorics, and they know what is rhetorics. It is the other. I know this especially with Bernard, because I've been working a lot on Bernard and Abelard. Bernard writing on Abelard in the harshest terms, and that's always seen as a proof of the relation between both of them. But when you read the letters of Bernard in their entirety, you see that in other letters he uses the same terms for himself, and then you start questioning yourself. What is he doing actually? And then even it's the same when you have all those passionate, when talking about, Anselm was mentioned by Benjamin, now you have also this passionate language. I know that when Bernard is really extolling his language, a friendship language and passionate language and almost letters of love to Peter of Cluny, there's a lot going wrong. There's a high tension. It's always the same. So there is a kind of tension between what we read and what actually is the factual reality behind it. And I think there we believe too much in what is written.
Okay, thank you. I actually think we should pass to the third talk now, to Lxxi Vilquin, who would like to intervene on Lxxi's talk.
Posso parlare in italiano?
May I speak Italian?
Grazie della tua bellissima.
First of all, thank you for your wonderful lecture. I fully agree with what you told us. I just like to highlight something important you said, that is economic history can be done only by integrating the written sources, the archaeological sources, and the sources of exact sciences. But we must find a right way to work among specialists. One way is to work in team and to discuss about our results, because otherwise we create something very bad. And one more thing that I'd like to highlight is the importance of the regional and sub-regional level of research. And so generalizations can come only from a multiplication of regional studies.
I briefly experienced that because a few years ago, Chris was involved with a colleague of mine, Nicolas Schroeder, and Jean-Pierre Devroy. We had a common project with Oxford University and Helena Hamrow, trying to document basically the landscapes in which the peasants were living on the one hand, and also the material experience and the cultural experience of peasants. Obviously, as you know, peasants do not write anything, and so you could say to yourself, well, it's done, because you cannot write anything. And so we had to collaborate a lot. It was mandatory, in fact. We appreciate that, but it gave us some result and a real sensitivity of the complexity of things. Because I have to say, I do not say that for Chris, of course, but for Nicolas and I, we were at this moment maybe a little bit more naive about the possibility of using instrumental proxies and to use that to extrapolate. And so we experienced during our different workshops the possibility of and the needs to closely situate also your sources in their context, exactly as written sources. By the way, you cannot extrapolate upon a single dossier. You have different distribution of sources. And something I noticed too, which is important, the problem is that as historians, to be honest, we do not have a perfect command of the technical aspects of the paleosciences. And there is a paradox in that we need you, but we are not able to understand exactly the limits of what you are giving us. The problem is that you have paleosciences almost everywhere now, and you have data samples. If you want an ERC, you need to provide large data samples and so on. But we are not able as historians to criticize properly, alone, the data we are using, and I do feel that especially in other fields which are expanding these days, like paleogenetics, I have to say I'm not at ease with that kind of things, because as historians we are supposed to be super critical of the written sources, and we are slaves and maybe dependent at least of some material we do not really understand.
Yes.
Donc là, je parle français, pardonnez-moi, mais toujours un peu lentement. Et donc, pour vous dire, évidemment, que j'ai trouvé votre leçon tout à fait excellente, tout à fait passionnante. La Belgique nous a procuré de très grands historiens de l'économie, de Pirenne, Verhulst, De Vroij. Maintenant, nous vous avons, il y en a d'autres, et véritablement, votre contribution me paraît absolument décisive pour cette semaine, d'autant que l'histoire économique a quand même été un peu laissée de côté depuis quelques décennies, et en la faisant vivre et de manière magistrale, vous faites vraiment quelque chose de très important. Alors, il y a beaucoup de suggestions à faire. Je vais être bref. Je voudrais juste vous poser deux petites questions. Et je retiens celle de l'étude à faire sur les domaines royaux autour de Paris. Il n'y a pas beaucoup de sources. Je pense que Rolf Grosjean en a déjà tiré beaucoup, mais bon, on verra. Alors, est-ce que, ou peut-être je peux me limiter à cette question, est-ce que vous estimez qu'il faut se poser la question de la prise en compte que les guerres locales, que la violence ait pu servir, enfin, ait pu freiner la croissance économique, ait pu représenter un véritable danger? Est-ce que vous avez des choses là-dessus? Parce qu'on a quand même beaucoup de sources. Moi, je suis porté à les relativiser, mais on a quand même beaucoup de sources qui nous parlent de dégâts faits par les guerres, des gens qui ont été obligés de bouger. Bon, après ça, un disciple de Toubert va vous dire ce sont des désertions de croissance, ils se sont regroupés, etc. Mais enfin bon, où est la preuve? Et est-ce que vous excluriez totalement qu'un système comme celui des paix diocésaines, qui sont un système qui se met en place sous pression sociale, c'est pas purement ecclésiastique, c'est vraiment un mouvement de la société, qui prévoit qu'on peut se plaindre des pillages, des prises illégales et obtenir des restitutions. C'est quand même un système qui a duré pendant 3 siècles dans les régions du midi de la France et qui a été présent dans le nord-ouest aussi. Est-ce que vous excluriez que les paix diocésaines aient pu servir dès le début du XIe siècle à apporter un peu plus de sécurité, donc à favoriser la croissance dont vous nous parlez véritablement, admirablement bien sous tous ces différents aspects?
Merci beaucoup, professeur Barthélémy, donc pour ces mots aimables. Et pour alors sur Paris, là je vous attendais d'ailleurs, vous l'avez compris, quand j'ai signalé que d'autres devraient s'en occuper. Je tiens juste à faire la connexion entre cette idée et des idées qui se trouvent aussi dans le livre de Chris, qui signale incidemment que la croissance de Paris finalement est assez mal expliquée. Et on a effectivement, alors bien sûr, on a une région avec un patrimoine royal, on a aussi le contact avec des terres fertiles, mais quel rôle joue finalement la dynamique institutionnelle dans cette croissance? Il faudrait probablement reprendre ça aussi de manière très sérieuse, mais le problème évidemment c'est sans doute les dossiers de source. Peut-être peut-on quand même relire Newman avec des lunettes d'historien économique et institutionnel du XXIe siècle et en dégager certaines perspectives. Alors, sur la guerre, je la rencontre en fait de temps en temps. Pas tellement directement dans les sources. Alors, les sources sur les crises que l'on peut mobiliser, par exemple, au XIe siècle, ce sont surtout dans le cas des crises alimentaires en tout cas, et des famines, des accidents de croissance toubériens, des chroniques en fait, et des chroniques que l'on retrouve de manière privilégiée par rapport à ces questions-là dans la principauté, dans le diocèse de Liège plutôt, dans le diocèse de Liège, pris de manière large, où il y a une floraison historiographique particulière au XIe, XIIe siècle, avec les Gesta Episcoporum et les Gesta Abbatum, qui n'a pas beaucoup d'équivalent. Peut-être vous avez parlé de la Normandie, je pense qu'il y a peut-être aussi d'autres sources narratives de cette qualité, mais en tout cas là on a vraiment une floraison de textes qui tient évidemment à l'existence d'un milieu lettré et épiscopal, épiscopète, pour reprendre une jolie formule qui avait été utilisée. Et là on a dans ce milieu liégeois et colonnais des descriptions de migration de gens qui sont poussés sur la route probablement par la guerre. Et donc on a des traces, semble-t-il, c'est un mot très à la mode, de disruption dans la production alimentaire et dans la distribution alimentaire, avec des afflux vers, de temps en temps, quelques monastères, et vers des villes. Et vers des villes dans lesquelles les évêques et les archevêques, bon, Dixerunt, évidemment, les chroniqueurs, il faudrait contrôler ça, c'est assez difficile, puisque ce sont des sources assez stéréotypées, dans lesquelles donc, les évêques et les archevêques auraient accordé l'asile temporaire. Mais alors, on aurait veillé, d'une part, à ce que les gens requittent la ville, donc on ne veut pas qu'ils s'établissent de manière durable, donc on les fait parfois travailler de manière forcée aussi, disent des sources plus tardives, et ensuite on les renvoie avec de l'argent et de la nourriture chez eux pour essayer de faire en sorte que le conflit ponctuel qu'est la guerre ne se transforme pas en problème économique structurel et durable, avec évidemment un manque de laboureurs, notamment dans les champs, parce qu'alors évidemment la crise qui est au départ ad hoc, risquerait de s'éterniser. Ça, c'est une des choses que l'on peut voir de manière claire dans les sources et qui peut, d'une autre manière, finalement, recouper aussi la question des effets négatifs de la guerre que vous avez déjà évoqué tout à l'heure dans votre communication. Pour les périodes plus tardives, comme là je parle du XIIe, XIIIe, XIVe siècle, on a alors des traces chiffrées, y compris dans les mouvements des prix, par exemple, que l'on peut vraiment juxtaposer par rapport à des données sur l'existence de conflits qui montrent combien les circuits d'approvisionnement, même locaux et régionaux, sont affectés par la guerre. Je suis convaincu aussi que l'on pourrait effectivement intégrer toutes les paix ecclésiastiques dans ce qu'on pourrait appeler les arrangements institutionnels de la nouvelle histoire institutionnelle et économique, qui fait Flores de manière parfois d'ailleurs excessivement modélisante, pourrait-on dire, de Douglas North et consorts, qui montre aussi que finalement l'Église a son rôle à jouer dans la manière de mitiger en tout cas la gravité des conflits et de créer un climat propice à la production agricole et à la circulation agricole. Voilà.
Ok, grazie. A questo punto bisogna...
So at this point we have to cut the discussion. I apologize with those who have wished to intervene, including me. But we have to finish now, because now there will be the presentation of the book. And so we will leave the stage and someone else will come here. So there will be another important moment now. So we can conclude. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.